Awesome. We are live, hopefully. Hi, everyone. My name is Shreya, and I am the founder of Bit Project. And I'm very lucky and excited to be here joined by Christian Lechner, who is one of our mentors for Bit Project and for our mentorship program. So, hi, Christian. How are you doing today?
Hi, Treya. I'm doing great. How are you?
Fantastic. I'm doing really good too. I literally just woke up like 5, 10 minutes ago. So, I'm doing fantastic.
Okay, for me, it's the end of a day and a week. So,
Yeah, time zones are weird, man. Thank you so much. It is the end of week 6 or close to the end of week 6 for our students. So they're all working on our final projects. And I'm really excited to kind of be joined by you to work through this API workshop. Um, before we get into it, would you mind giving us a little introduction about yourself and who you are and why you care about mentorship in the first place? And then we'll just dive into the workshop.
yeah, sure. So, where am I located? From time zone perspective, you could already guess it's probably Europe, so it's Germany. To be precise, it's in Bavaria, near a city there called Passau, which you might know or might not know. Um, I'm working at SAP as a development architect in the area of the business technology platform, supporting the technology office of SAP, which has basically not that much to do with Azure at the moment. But I am really happy to share knowledge and to um, exchange with the community. And that's how I got into the Azure Functions University that you might be aware of. And over that way, I came to the Bit project because Mark Duker, who is the founder of the Azure Functions University, kind of pinged me and said that that might be interesting for you. And yes, it is. So I'm really happy to support with this curriculum, which is, from my perspective, really a super good curriculum. So absolutely kudos to all who have been involved, who are involved in that area, because I think that's really great stuff to learn, great stuff to start with. And I would have been happy if that would have existed 20 years ago.
That's
Yeah,
fair. I mean, I'm
that's
really grateful to our mentor community, especially people like Mark, who are bringing amazing mentors like you to our team as well. And I'm really excited to see what this workshop is about. So, could you tell us what our goal is for today? What are we learning?
yeah. So with a little bit of delay, because your API week was week 2, which was kind of jeopardized due to lightning striking my house and burning everything which was network related. We are taking a look at APIs and how to use them, how to find APIs, how to read the documentation, interpret the documentation, talking a bit about I wouldn't say best practices, but common practices around APIs. And I would like to pick up the things that have been discussed in week 1. So what was the point there was how do you present yourself to a possible employer? How do you tune your resume? And that was the discussion that GitHub is one point where you can present yourself. And that's true. So the idea now of today is, let's say you have a really cool project and you spend a lot of time and effort in there, and you have also a great README of that project. So in order to make life easy for those folks who take a look at that one. Now with GitHub, you can share the GitHub link, Twitter, LinkedIn, Polywork, whatsoever. But the interaction might be a bit difficult. So on GitHub, of course, you have discussions which are quite new. You have issues where you can interact with the community. But what you might also want to have in order to get a bit more spice into your resume, push that stuff to a blogging platform, right? So you can have likes, you can have, which would be stars on your GitHub repo, which are hard to catch. You can have interaction with that. You might get followers there and see what the community thinking about your project. And at least from my experience, that's one important ingredient in order to spread the word what you're doing. So basically what we want to do today is We take a repository, we have a README in there, and we want to bring that out of GitHub into Dev.to, which is a blogging platform. I think BitProject is also using it. And we want to do that via an Azure function as, let's say, glue code between GitHub and Dev.to. So that will be the setup for today.
That is such an interesting use case. I love how it ties into all of the work that we're doing. And it's something very like any of the students that are working on could actually, like a need that anyone could actually have, which is fantastic. It's relatable, basically. Okay, let's dive into it. What do we need to, how do we start?
Okay, so then I will now, sorry, share my screen. Let's put away that. So I will not see anything. You have to shout out if something is not readable, is not visible to you.
We will yell at you aggressively.
Yeah, you scream at me. I will not see any faces or something like that. I will not see any chat. So I have to purely rely on the audio. Now, what you see now is the GitHub repository, which we want to take. It's a public big GitHub repository. It's a fantastic GitHub repository, of course, because it has Azure functions in it. And basically, it describes what we will do today. So we will take this project and the README file here and a bit of the description here and the title of the project or the name of the repository and push that into Dev.to. Now for that, we need a means to interact with GitHub and to interact with Dev.to. And for those who are following the curriculum, be it self-paced or as a one-on-one mentorship, that's what you have been doing. So you have been connecting bits and pieces via APIs throughout the course of the previous weeks within your functions. So you basically, it's not like Lego, but it's not that different. So you take the bits and pieces, bring them in the order in order to fulfill your business needs, so to say, and then get the hopefully expected result. Now, when it comes to interacting with systems, the first thing that you have to have is an API. And an API is an application programming interface. And basically, that's also the name of the game. So you have an application, and that offers an interface to the outside world where you can interact with the system or with the application. So it tells you what data can you read, can you manipulate the data, what types of data do you have within the system. So that's an essential ingredient in order to do those interactions. Now, usually you also have to do some stuff before you can interact, so authenticate yourself, which we'll see in a second. And when you are talking about APIs and the internet and GitHub or any other thing at the moment, you will end up saying, yeah, we have some REST APIs. Now, there I want to drop some words where this REST thingy comes from. And basically, you should see now a PhD thesis talking about architectural style and the design of network-based software architectures by a man called Roy Fielding from the year 2000. And he was the one who coined the term REST. So that's the representational state transfer, short REST, that was coined by him, that was first described by him. And what's important to understand is that's an architectural pattern. So that's how you define and how you design something that is not necessarily coupled to HTTP. Although HTTP as protocol of the web is very well fitting into that architectural pattern, you can also apply that to other communication protocols like gRPC. So it's not like REST and HTTP are interchangeable. REST is the architectural pattern, and HTTP is some kind of instance of that pattern, or very well fitting to the pattern. However, there are also some pitfalls that are common usage that are not that great from my perspective. I will point them out at a later section of today's session. Now, having said that, let's dig into what do we need. So basically, we need to read out data from GitHub. So if you Google for GitHub REST API, you will land at this page, and please tell me if letters are too small. You have.
Could we increase it by a couple? Yeah, that looks good.
So you have the REST API description, and what you see here, and that's quite typical, is you have basically the entities of the business domain that GitHub exposes. Now that's a quite sophisticated term for basically that's what you see when you interact with GitHub on the UI. So you have actions, you can take a look at billing, you create branches, you did that a lot. You can do commits via the API, and of course you can interact with the content of the repository. So when you dive through that, and I think it's very easy to digest, you will come to the point of repositories, and there you have, of course, a lot more subtopics there. And I already looked at the get repository API. And that's also quite, let's say, typical way how to present an API. So basically, you have a short description of the API. You have the parameters, so how to interact with the API. So what's requested from you in order to make a successful call. Like here, you need to hand over the owner and the repository. And you have the endpoint that you address. And you, of course, when it's HTTP, you have the HTTP verb that you need to use in order to interact with the endpoint. In addition, you have examples. That's optional, but usually that's in there. So at least you usually have a curl example, which is quite helpful in order to see how the parameters have to be filled. So you can see here we need probably a header. We need an authorization via a token. So basically we need to authenticate. And we need to pass in the URL. What's cool here, we also have an JavaScript part, which looks a bit different. And the reason for that is if a company is heavily relying on the interaction via REST, it usually makes the life for the developers easier and offers software development kits, so SDKs. And Octokit, which is the natural name for the SDK for GitHub, which has the Octocat in there, offers exactly such an SDK. And what I also like about that SDK, it does not hide everything from you. So it's quite clear what you do, but it helps you, for example, because here you do not need to take care about the accept a header. So that's just something that is done automatically. Now, what's also part of the description of the API is usually some examples. Like here for a successful request where you can then scroll through and see what should come back, and there comes back a lot. Then with GitHub, there is one special thing in there which is called response schema. So maybe you came across that. That helps you a lot when interacting with JSON. It's a so-called JSON schema, which allows you to validate your JSON files. So usually JSON is completely freestyle, but with JSON schemas, you can define how the structure of a JSON file looks like, and GitHub is so kind to provide some. And then you have, of course, a response, because that's why you make the call, right? With several status codes. So here we have 200, which is okay. And we have then specific HTTP codes, which represent situations that could happen. So maybe you're not authenticated, then it's forbidden. Maybe you wanted to fetch a repository that's not existing, then the resource is not found. Now, this is exactly one point where, from my perspective, it's debatable to say that's a REST interface, because these are the status codes of the transfer protocol, which is HTTP. if GitHub would switch to gRPC for some reason or add gRPC support, they would have to add additional status codes because gRPC has no HTTP status codes. So that's kind of, from my perspective, a bit of a weak point when bringing REST into HTTP to or abuse, I would say, the HTTP status codes for error messages that has nothing to do with the technical transfer. But that's what you will always see, and that's what you will always have with those APIs. So you have to deal with it. If you design an API yourself, maybe you could do something different. We won't do in today's session, but just to bring it into your head. So that's one API that we will use. We will also use another API, which is the get a repository README, which is also, I think, a quite logical structure. So you get the README from the owner and the repo. And then when we have the data, we need to push that to Dev.to. And the documentation for the Dev.to API is a bit hidden. So it's under developers.forum.com. And you can see here the documentation, which gives you some general guideline and also makes you aware that it's not yet for productive use. So it's in beta state, so things might change, things might break. I did not recognize that over the last couple of months, but be aware of that if you are playing with an API. And we have here the API, where you can also download a specification. So that's now a so-called Open API specification, which describes the structure of the API, which is basically exactly what you see here. So this UI that you see is based on this Open API specification. You might also read the term Swagger specification for that. That was kind of the predecessor of Open API. And yeah, this API we will use in order to publish an article. So as you can see here already, it looks similar to the one of GitHub. So we have some description here. We have some additional information that there are rate limits. And we see we need an authorization via an API key, which is the usual way. And then we have some object that we have to hand over. That's how it looks like. And then we have different responses, like 201 when an article is created, and all the other ones when that could happen in the error case. Yeah, that's basically all the ingredients that we need. In addition, and that's nothing that I will show, is you need to fetch an API key. You can do that via your Dev.to user. So if you go to dashboard, to your settings, then you can fetch an API key there. For GitHub, you have to go to your GitHub settings and navigate to your developer settings, and then you can fetch a personal access token that you will need in order to access the GitHub APIs. The only exception up to now is public repositories and read activities. So you can read quite some data from public repositories without authenticating, but you might not get all the data. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. And now with all that blah, blah, let's start the coding. I will keep that open as a fallback if I'm not sure about some code snippets or I'm just too lazy to type. So what we will do now is we will create a function.
Okay, right before you get into that, just want to remind students that Christian is building this project and he's going to try to cover as much information as possible. But if you have any questions about what he's saying, any specific concept that he mentions that doesn't make sense, or even if he explains something and you want more detail on it, he is like a genius. So just feel free to ask and he will let you know. I will be here to just read out your comments and stuff. So you can either ask in the Twitch/YouTube chat, or you can ask on the Slido where it's anonymous if you prefer that. And yeah, go ahead, Christian.
Good that there's no pressure from your side.
Yeah.
So we will create a JavaScript function. We will do an HTTP trigger there. We will call it blog post publisher. I mean, basically that's something that you already know by heart if you have done this training. And then you have the classical layout. Nobody needs that sample.dat data of your function project. And we will basically quite start from a clean slate. What we want to have is, of course, a response at some point in time where we will put in a response status, which might be different depending on what we achieve. So we will have a response status, which is, we defaulted to 200 because we are optimistic. And we will have a response message, which is empty. Okay, so that's point 1. And well, then what do we want to have? How should we structure it? So let's create a file called request.http, which is a very specific file. I'm using an extension here called REST client. It's this first one, which allows you to do REST requests or HTTP requests via such a file. I like that very much in contrast to Postman, but that's of course personal preferences. So what we will have is something like a local host.
Really quick, why do you prefer using the REST client over something like Postman or Insomnia?
Yeah, the reason for that is that with this file and all the requests being in the same repository as the code, I have that under source control, and I can push it into the GitHub repository, and everything is code. With Postman, you can of course also create the files that contain your requests, but you have an additional tool to open. You have to deal with an additional tool. You have to switch windows. I personally do not like that very much. I like to keep things, let's say, self-contained or things together, and that's why I really like that one. And from the perspective of power, it's as powerful as Postman. So you can do consequent requests and use the response of request 1 and request 2. So there is no downside. At least I did not find any with respect or compared to Postman.
Yeah, I completely
But
agree. Go ahead.
it's absolutely personal flavor. If you like Postman, if you have been working a lot with Postman, go ahead.
Yeah. And if you're curious about what Postman is and what the REST client is and what purpose it serves, what is could you give us like a brief understanding of that?
So I had a short. Did you ask me something? Was it a
Sorry,
question?
yeah.
Or?
I was asking what the purpose
Okay.
of things are,
What,
like REST
what the
client.
things are? Yeah. If you want to interact with the endpoints of a REST of a system that exposes those REST APIs, you need to have some tooling. So of course you can use the browser, because basically what it does in the backend is also doing requests, but you have a very hard time to do post requests there, for example. And in order to execute those requests, in order to parameterize those requests, so what do I hand over to the request? That's where those tools come in quite handy. And you can also structure your requests in there. So for example, within Postman, you have collections where you can collect your settings, and you can very easily combine the requests as you can do them here with respect to doing the authentication and then fetching the information necessary for a follow-up call. So that's where these tools play their big role. So it's mainly about interacting with HTTP endpoints.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so that's good. It already remembered that one. some dry-runs. So we have usually with Azure Functions this endpoint, and now it's really open to you how you want to hand over the data. So maybe one could think about doing that via query parameters. One could do that in the body. One could do that as an array in the body if I want to publish more than one blog post at a time. We will now, for the sake of this demo, use the body of the HTTP request. And what we basically want to do is we want to say, I have a repo owner, which would be me. And I have a repo name, which would probably be, and I've got again that one, which will be this one. And I want to call the Azure function, hand over that information, and then publish the blog post somewhere. So that would be the idea. Now, in order to do that, within the function, what I will do is, first of all, validate that those two parameters are in there. So I will check if I have a body transferred when the call arrives. So as you can see here, we get the request into our function. And then I also want to see that the body has something like a repo owner in it. And I also want to see that the request has a repo name, because that's what I need. If that is not the case, and if I could type, I want to say response status equals 400, which is basically means the caller has something done wrong. And I want to hand in a response message, which says, please provide the repo name and owner in the body of the post request. So if we are not lucky, we get an error message. If we did everything wrong, everything right, we will end up in the if clause. Now I will transfer that to some local parameters. So I want to have the repo name, so that I do not have to reference everything every time. And I will take the repo owner also as a local parameter. Now that's, again, a question of how you want to do things. I prefer to have that as a variable.
We have a quick question about why we're adding these two variables into this file.
That's just a question of let's say, personal style. So you can always within the code dereference that JSON object. However, from my perspective, I think it's more readable at a later point in time to just see repo name, because then I know that's the repository name, instead of reading, okay, that's the request, that's the body of the request, and within the body of the request, I have a repo name, which is basically the repo name. So it's just, it's exaggerated to say that that's a mental overload, but I think it makes it more readable and makes it easier to understand if you have those two, well, shortcuts, abbreviations for those parameters of the body.
Yeah.
But as I said, it's nothing wrong to use that directly.
Makes sense.
Okay, then what we want to do is we want to call the GitHub REST API, right? We want to get the information from GitHub. Now, let's put that over here, make it bigger. We want to get the repository. So basically what we can do is we can first copy that over. So we have an Octokit, we have to hand over an access token that we do not have yet. So we have a GitHub API, GitHub API key that we will fetch in a second. So we will hand that over here. And then we do this call here where we now hand over the repo owner as well as the repo name. Now, what do we have to do in order to do that, to be able to do that? Well, of course, we need to get the Octokit SDK. And as you can see here, that's really cool. They have the URL right here. So we should see
Quick
some example here.
question. What is the
Yeah.
difference between an SDK and an API?
An SDK is basically some pieces of code that wrap some functionality for you. So this can be, let's say, some mathematical functions that where you don't want to implement the algorithm, and they kind of wrap them for you and make them easier to access for you. So that's an SDK. An API is an interface where you interact with a system, with an application. So it's a bit fuzzy to understand, but with an API, you just have, let's say, an endpoint, an URL that you call. And with an SDK, you have a complete, in this case for JavaScript, a node module that contains a lot of functionality that you can put into your code and use it within your code. So that's kind of the way how I would coin it.
That makes sense.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I don't know if my example is going to make it more difficult to understand or hopefully easier to understand, but even for the Courier, we have an API. Courier is an API, and you can use post requests to interact with it. You have an endpoint, you have an API key, all of those things, but you can also choose to install an NPM package, which is our Courier SDK. And if you do that, you don't have to make a request, but you still end up doing like the same type of functionality. So it's not like they're two completely different things. It's just the way that you interact with those different softwares.
Yep. So it's more about convenience. So we will see later that for Dev.to we do not have an SDK. So then we need to use a different functionality.
Gotcha.
So that's what we need to put into the code. Then we need, of course, to install that. So we need an npm I and an Octokit core. So that should now download the internet, and then we are good. So we should see now that we have a node modules folder, exactly. So we have now that put into our project. What is open now is where do I get the key? So as I said before, I will not show you my keys, just because we had some experience with that on prior live streams where there are some clever folks who look at Twitter and then use the key. But I will just take the one that I have downloaded before, and I put that in my local settings.json. That's kind of the best practice, that to put that stuff in the local settings.json. Why? Because it's not getting committed. It's excluded from your Git by default. And that's the place where you can access your environment variables then. You do not have to change your code once you have that and put those in Azure in your application settings. So that's also a big advantage. So what I will do now is I will take that one, move that over, replace it. Yes. And that was that. Now I have to quickly do a glimpse how I called them. It was those twos. So what I will do now is I will, of course, fetch those I make that now a bit bigger. In my code, so don't get nervous by me doing copy pasting, which looks not reasonable at the first point in time. So I will put in the GitHub key, and I will also put in the Dev.to API key, because we need it anyway at a later point in time. Okay, so we have now the keys. We have the Octokit SDK. We make the first request. We also, so here we get the information about the repository. We also need to get the information from the README, as we have seen before. And here I will just copy this code snippet and put it here. So as you can see here, it's a bit of a different endpoint that is targeted. So it's not a README endpoint, but I can, of course, reuse the other variables because that did not change. By the way, it's also a question of your personal preferences. If you put in the semicolon or not, JavaScript will not care about that. But be consistent. That's something that's important. Now we make the call. Maybe we also want to get the result in a way that we can use it. So I would say we have here the repo metadata, which we get from here, and we get the repo readme, and we will later see that that's in a special way how we get it. We get it decoded, encoded. And with that, we can now check if the call was successful. That's what we would do first, right? So we would see, did we succeed? And in order to do so, we can check the status. And jumping back to the documentation, we have read requests. So I would expect the status to be 200 if everything's okay. So that's true. So what I will do now is check if the status is 200. What I will do now is something that I would say don't do at home. I will check both statuses in one line. And we will in a second see what's the downside of that. Namely, when we have to deal with the error case. So if the call was not successful, I, of course, want to return something reasonable. And now the question is which call went wrong and which status then is the one to hand back, or did both go wrong and they have different statuses. So usually you would do this stuff for every call. Now for the sake of time, I will basically just hand back one status, which is 500, something went wrong on our side. And then I will do something like the calls to GitHub did not succeed. Status of metadata is we have the repo metadata status and status of README is the other one, right? So we have repo README encoded status. Yep. So that's how we would do it. It also makes sense to of course add a log message there if you're running it on on Azure, but also if you want to run it here on the terminal. So we will also make our life easy here. We just hand over the response message. And I say that's the thing. If you would do something like that in a real world application, you would probably define some schema for your response messages that you log, for the messages that you log, to be precise, because you want to analyze them automatically, and you do not want to have to think about how they are structured. So you would usually have some response message which says status dash message dash error code whatsoever. Yeah, with that, we are already not too bad, right? So what we can do now is we can check if we get something back. So I will start the debugger, which is just pressing F5, thanks to the work of the Azure Functions creators, because we have the launch configuration already there. Now, what usually does not work is the first debugging run. Ooh, it works. Okay, cool. Usually, you might get some error messages which come from somewhere deep within the Azure Functions runtime. Don't get nervous if you do the debugging for the very, very first time of your Azure function. Abort the debugging and start it again, because there was just some hiccup when doing the very first initialization of your project. So now we have the endpoint. We can now make the call. I think I did not make any typo. So we can send the request, and then we can step through it. So we get the Octokit SDK. We do the request, the first one. We do the second one. So at least we did not mess up anything severe. So no exception was raised. And now let's see. We have. I should have put status in here, right? Let's see. Also here we have the status 200. So now it would jump into the error message because I just forgot to put in the status here. But that looks not too shabby. So let's run it. So I would now get 500, of course, because I forgot to code it the right way. But we are on a good path. Let's do it again. To see that we are good. So I think that breakpoint is then sufficient. We will send the request. We hit it here. So we have status 200, we have status 200, and now we are also fetching it. And now let's take a look at this little guy here. So we have the repo readme encoded, which is a JavaScript object. We have the data in here. And we see that we have an encoding with base 64, and we see that we have the content which does not look readable, at least not for me. And yeah, we have some more information in here, which is handed back, like the name of the file, the path to the file with respect to the root of the repository. And the same is true for the repo metadata response. So again, we have here a data object within the repo metadata, which gives us back a lot of information that we want to know or do not want to know. So we have here something like the description that we will use for the blog post, and a lot of other information. So that's all looking good. Why do we have a breakpoint there? That makes some sense. So now we are fine. Okay, then what do we have to do next? We now have fetched the information. So basically what we want to do is we want to create the article, right? For Dev.to, and we want to publish the article. So that's kind of the idea that we want to do. Now, we just saw that the README was encoded. So we first need to decode that stuff in order to have a readable content of our blog post. So what I will do is I will put in repo README, or I would just say README decoded. And for that, we use the buffer from method, and that one takes two parameters. It first of all takes the encoded source, which is the repo README encoded data, and it was content. And then I want to have the repo README encoded data and the encoding. So it's base 64 according to the documentation, but if they change something, that will be resilient to that. And then I want to do that to a string, and I want to have UTF-8 output. So if I did not make anything wrong, we will have the UTF-8 string of the README in this parameter. And then we have to create the object that we hand over to Dev.to. So let's shortly jump back to the API description. We want to create a new article. And in order to create that article, we need to have an article object, well, which contains of a title, makes sense, of a body, which is markdown, also makes sense. We have that already. Then we want to say if we publish it at once or if we want to store it in a draft state so that we can see it, but nobody else can see it. Series is something specific to Dev.to, so you can link several blog posts together. We can hand in an image description. We can hand in tags, which is cool. We are no organization, so basically we need to build something like that. And well, let's do that. So what we will do now is we will create a Dev.to article. And in order to do so, we will call a function, which will build us the Dev.to article. And here we hand over the repo metadata data object, which contains all the information about our repository, where we can drag out the title and the description. And the README decoded would also be great to have that. And with that, let's do function, which let's just copy that to avoid typos. Say that's the README repo data. And now I will do a little bit of a shortcut because that's just typing things around. Let's see. Where do we have it? Here. So let's just copy that and put that in here. So what do I do here? I say I define a Dev.to article, which has the structure as needed in order to call the endpoint, which is an object, a JSON object, which is an article, and which has another object contained in there. So I have to do some stuff here. So it's a repo metadata, README decoded. Looks like that. We have the tags, which I have pre-filled. So I think we can do 4 tags. So we can also put in bit project in here. I will not publish it at once, and I will put in an image as a surprise. What's on the image? And then I return that JSON object back to the caller. And now we can do our call to Dev.to. Now, this is also something that should be described somewhere, right? Because we would like to do the call. Now, as you can see here, we do not get any information about the get, or I'm just missing it. So maybe that's due to the sizing. So now you basically will see not too much. But now you can see that we have here on the right-hand side this post. Or at least you can imagine that there is a post. And we can now see how do we do the call. So we now have really to call an HTTP endpoint, which we can see here. So that would be the URL that we have to call. And then we have to hand over a content type, which is JSON. We have to hand over the API key also via the header. We have to do a post because we want to create it. And we have to hand over the object. So that sounds reasonable. And we will then hopefully get back a 201, which is usual for creating something. Yeah, so then let's see if we can do that. So we say the Dev.to endpoint is the one that I just copied. And then we have to make the call to this endpoint. So we say we have Dev.to response, which is a wait to the famous fetch library that you basically have used now, I think, for a lot of times. So we have to install the fetch API. So npm I node fetch, and we have to install version 2 in order to be consistent with the common JS modules that we use. Otherwise, we would have an error here, and then we have to import it. So we say const fetch is require to node fetch. And now there is one thing that I do besides making typos. I will pin the versions. So usually when you do an npm install, it will put in that little symbol here so that the version gets updated with respect to semantic versioning. So if there is an update of the, I think, the minor version or the bug fix version, which is this one and this one, it will install a newer version if you do an npm install. And I don't want that. I tested with that, with those dependencies, and I want to use it with those dependencies. So what I will shortly do is delete the package.json and do another npmi. Now that's something when you ask yourself, why the heck does this guy do that? It's just to be safe, to use the versions that I used when implementing the functionality at a later point in time. If I push that to a repository, even if there is a package log.json in there, and you would clone it and would do an npm install, and there is a later version in there, which might be 4.1.4 or 4.0.6, it will install that one if I still have this symbol in there. If I do it like that, you will use the same version that I did. With that detour to package management in Node, what do we have to do now? We have the, no, not the key. I want to have, of course, the endpoint here, Dev.to endpoint that I want to address. And then, sorry for that, I have to put in some data. And again, as I'm really lazy, so I have to put in the method, which is post. I have to put in the right header, which we'll see in a second, and the body. And again, let's do a little shortcut here. and just copy that. So shouldn't that be that? No, shouldn't. As you have been working with fetch, I think I do not have to explain too much there. We hand over the method, which is post, as we saw in the description of the API. We hand over the headers, which contain the API key, which we have called Dev.to API key. That's good. Then we have to specify the content type. That's something that Dev.to wants us to do according to the documentation. And then we hand over the body that we have to stringify from our JSON object. So it's not a Java object that we have, JavaScript object that we hand over, but the string that represents that object. And with that, we can do the call. And then we have the same procedure as every call, so to say. We have to check if we messed something up, and in this case, if I messed something up or not. So we have to do the Dev.to response and check the status, and we have to check this time for 201 because we created something. If this did not succeed, we will just hand over the Dev.to response status and say publishing to Dev.to field. Publishing to Dev.to failed. We have a status, which would then be, in this case, the Dev.to response status. And there's also some additional information contained in the Dev.to response, in the fetch response. So we have that into the Dev.to response, and that's
real quick because we have a question that's
go
asked,
ahead.
what is a good practice to read documentation? This person said that they're kind of overwhelmed with a lot of documentation out there. Do you have any tips?
What is a good way to read documentation? So first of all, if you are overwhelmed with documentation, then that might also be that the documentation is not good. So it's not always to search for the error on your hand. So it depends a bit on how you do your learning, how you do your studying. That there are different approaches there. So what I usually do, let's say if we have Azure Functions. And of course, you see that I'm in Germany. So usually, as far as I know, where Microsoft is definitely a role model when it comes to documentation, but there is also good documentation at Azure sites. I think Courier also has a quite neat documentation of their APIs on how to deal with them. You usually have some quick starts. So how do I approach a new topic when I need to read the documentation or dig into the documentation? What I first do is I take a look at the quick starts and try them out, just in order to get some hands-on experience how things behave. Now, if I have done that, and I want to have some more in-depth experience with it, I either go to something that is contained, that there are always some samples, either directly in the documentation or somewhere on the GitHub or GitLab, depending on the company, where you find some more code examples that helps me to understand a bit deeper how things are working. So I'm more learning by example than learning by the abstract documentation and first reading the abstract documentation. when I think I have some basic grip on the stuff that I want to know, I then go to the concepts or to the, I think that's in the concepts area usually, on the topic that I want to know more. So let's say I have started with Azure Functions. I have tried out my first quick start with an HTTP function. I might have done now a function with blob storage. And now I want to know how this triggering really works, because I saw this HTTP trigger works out of dark magic. I will look up in the documentation exactly that area and then dive into that one. So what I'm trying to explain, hopefully, is start somewhere where you feel comfortable and where you can get a bit of hands-on experience, and then expand from there the way how you dig into the topic, and build kind of a network from the point where you started. So jump to okay, I want to know about triggers and bindings. Okay, I have understood that now. Now I want to understand how is this scaling done for Azure Functions. So I will take a look at that next. And maybe then I have some questions. Well, how is it best to do error handling? Because I'm running into errors and I somehow deal with them, but how can I do that? Then I jump into that section. That's how I personally would do it. If you are a very, let's say, a person that likes to start with a lot of theory and then wants to dive into the hands-on part, I would then start with the concepts or maybe also the references, to wrap your head around that and then start with the examples. But that's quite hard for me to give an example because that's not the way I would learn it. Now, when you say overwhelmed, I'm now an old guy, been in IT now for 17 years. And be assured, I'm also overwhelmed by information, by documentation, and by learning things. Maybe that's due to my age, because I'm old and forgetting things very fast. But maybe that's just because things are evolving very fast. So don't get frustrated and don't get demotivated by that. Start at one point and take it from there. You will not find many people. They will be the rare exception who know about everything. You start somewhere and then you expand your knowledge and you get an expert in some area. You might get some insights in another area, but you will not know everything in depth in every area. So that's just an illusion. So start somewhere, expand, grow, and try to get an expert in some area, but don't try to get an expert in every area because you probably will fail. And as I said, it's always overwhelming. So if you, for example, start with Kubernetes, which also has a great documentation, by the way, which is a completely different topic, you will be, oh gosh, super overwhelmed by the documentation and by the concepts. But as you can see here, there is also getting started. So try to get started, try to do some tutorials, try to learn the basics. And as you can see here, the structure is not that different for a lot of documentations. And then once you have, for example, done step one, then maybe dive a bit more into the depth, what's behind that, and then go back and try the next step and take it that way in an iterative manner. So don't try to eat the elephant in one bite, but take it bit by bit. I
I
hope
just
that
want to add to that
helps.
really quick. If you are working with documentation and you find yourself a little confused, don't try to use the documentation as like a single source of information. Definitely Google things, check out other like online communities. There's a lot of developers that'll explain concepts that are in docs on other websites. So if you're stuck and you're not understanding something, don't just like give up on yourself. It'll take time. It's a very relatable struggle to, deal with documentation and everything.
So as I said, there is also bad documentation. So it needn't to be your fault if you struggle with the documentation. Maybe the documentation is crappy. And as Shreya said, there are more sources than just the documentation. What I think is really valuable is YouTube. So you have a lot of tutorials, a lot of great people sharing their knowledge there and explaining different parts, be it Node.js, be it Azure Functions, be it I don't know what. And that's really something where you can also wrap your head around that, because you can follow along at your own pace, take a look at the video, bring it back to the point where you lost the connection or the understanding, and then continue from there. So that's all perfect. And don't get discouraged, and don't get doubts about yourself because you just did not understand the documentation from A to Z. I don't do, and I'm not that frustrated. And Shreya and I made a video not too long ago, and we basically struggled 1 hour to call an API endpoint. So that's also something. Even we had the documentation there, which was crap. So that's kind of usual, so to say. Also, it's a bit frustrating at the point in time when you do it, but on the next day, maybe it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It was embarrassing, but we got it at the end of the day, or after a few days. But I also want to add, right now you're in your learning stages, so don't focus too much about like, I just need to get this project working. I'd recommend putting the focus on like, do I understand what's happening, regardless of whether it works or not? Because sometimes technology just doesn't work out with you. But as long as you have a deep understanding of why things are or aren't working, that's good. And when you're reading through documentation, try to imagine it as like would I be able to explain this to someone else? And if you can, that's great. But if you feel like you're talking about it and you're using terminology that you don't even completely understand, again, like definitely make sure you understand all of those concepts before you try to integrate these technologies into your own projects, because learning is a lot more important at this stage than just getting your project to work. But yeah, I'll let Christian take over again.
Absolutely. And if you have questions, I mean, we have Piazza, we have Discord. So don't shy back from asking questions. That's what the mentors are for, to answer you and to support you. So now I will just take that code before I forget it. No, I didn't want to take that code. It was Dev.to response status and status text. That's the one that we wanted. So if something fails, we hand back the status and we say that was the status text that the HTTP call returned. And then we, for the sake of time, as we are already quite over an hour, I will just copy that. Nope, that didn't work. Okay, so what did we do? We fetched the response from the Dev.to endpoint where we published our blog post, hopefully successfully. We checked what the response status was. So if it's 201, which means we have created our blog post successfully, what we will do is, and you have done that now probably 1,000 times, transfer the response to a JSON object so that we get the body in a handable format, and then we will hand back a response, which is the status, and some nice response message. Now, when publishing something to Dev.to in draft mode that we did, so sorry for that, I think I forgot to mention that. We put that into draft mode, so we will not publish it. You will get back an URL by Dev.to, but that will point to a dead end. So you have to go to the dashboard there, and then we will hand back the response message. In case we did not succeed, we tell the caller we have made an error, and we cannot do anything else than just handing back that error. And with that, we can give it another try, I would say. So let's save it. That's important. And let's see how things work. So nothing wrong here. Except for one thing. Let me shortly abort it. We want to create something, so we definitely only want to support the post endpoint. That's something that you have to do or can do in the function.json file of your function. Which HTTP methods do you want to support? And for that function, I only want to support the post method. That makes sense. No, making the tension unbearable if things work. So at least the function starts up. We have a host log, that's good. We will send the request. That was where we were before. So now we have the content, we have the encoding, base64. So let's jump over. Oh, that looks better, right? That looks like human readable. Then we will build the article with our own little function, where we have now the article. We have everything in there. That looks nice. We have the endpoint, and then we make our post call to the endpoint with the article. And let's see what happens. Yippee, status 201. That worked. So we can now just walk it through, and we will see, okay, we have the response that we got before. We have the blog post published at Dev.to. Check let's do it that way, check it on the dashboard. That's exactly what we wanted to see. So let's see what happened. We have Dev.to. I will open my dashboard, and we have our post in draft state. And we have the right picture on top. We have the serverless bit project camp. Usually struggling with the sizing of the picture. We have our information here with the tags, and we have all the information that we stored in our README now as a blog post that we can share, which is also maybe a bit nicer to read than just the README. And we have all the options there within it's a long one, within the blogging platform to start discussions, to see if people would like to interact with that, and so on. And we can also get some statistics out there. How often was it read, and so on, once we have published that. Now, let's try to republish it and see what happens there, just for the sake of having some fun with debugging. So I will put a breakpoint in here. I will do the same request again. And I will try to do it again. And now let's see what happens. We have a 422, okay. So it was not published. And it tells me it's an unprocessable entity. Okay, so I have a 422, everything is okay. Looks, well, it's okay because I published it, but I would like to know why was that. And that's basically one error that you get back, and that's a fair error because it's described within the page. So I'll make it a bit larger, which means that your blog post is already existing. So you have it on your Dev.to already, and you cannot just create it again, because it was already created. So what we would have to do in order to update it, we would have to do a put on the article with an ID XYZ in order to update it. So that's now also how you can dive into the documentation. You get an error code, you look at the error code, and then you have to reflect a bit. Post means create, usually in HTTP. So it's already created. Put means update. So I would have to use a different method in order to do that. Yeah, and with that, we are at the end of the session with respect to the coding. As you saw, all the code is available on my GitHub repo. It might deviate a bit from what I've done in the live stream because usually you name things differently. But you can take a look at that repository if you want to check the code or if you want to clone it and use it.
Awesome.
That's all possible.
So we have
Okay.
one question, and if y'all have any other questions while we're talking, please feel free to jot them either in the chat or in the Slido. But the one question that we did have, let me find it real quick, was how do you include some aspects of security in this API?
So you mean in the API that I have exposed, or
Yeah.
okay? So with Azure Functions, I have to share the screen again. So with Azure Functions, basically the built-in functionality is a bit limited. So what you have is you have this authentication level, which could be anonymous or function. There is also a third option, which I have never used. I think it's administrator or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what it does is Anonymous says it exposes an endpoint which is completely publicly available. So if you know the endpoint, you can call it and it will be processed. As a first level of defense, so to say, you can put in auth level equals function, which means when you deploy the function to Azure, you will have a function key or an API key. So basically, it's the same functionality as we have used here. So, and from the start, only you know the API key. So only you can call that endpoint. If you spread that API key, well, everybody who knows that API key can call it. But of course, you can change the API key. And if you see misuse or something like that, and then you can create a new API key. That would be kind of one way how to do it, how to authenticate calls. And as you have seen here with the Dev.to key, I don't know if you wondered about that. I called the endpoint with an article that I want to publish. And within the article, there was absolutely no information for whom I want to publish that. So maybe I wanted to publish for Shreya. That's not possible, at least not with my API key, because this one is personalized for Dev.to. So I create the Dev.to API key, and Dev.to then checks the API key. Is it a valid key? Okay, then somebody is allowed to do the call. And who does this key belong to? Because this key only allows me to do interactions with all the content that I have published, and not the content that Bit Project has published. And the same is true for the GitHub API key. It's not that obvious at a first glance. With the GitHub API key, I mean, we can shortly take a look to see what's different there. It's here under developer settings, so it's variable hidden. And here you have the PATs, the personal access tokens that you can create. And you can generate a token. And of course, I need to enter a password. And there are some measures of security for those API tokens that you have to think about. One is expiration. So with Azure Functions, the key that you create when you set the authentication to function does basically never expire, which is not the best practice, let's say it that way. So usually you would enforce those tokens to expire and do a refresh after several amount of days. And then a second point that is specific to those access tokens for GitHub is you can specify what the functionality that uses the token is allowed to do. So it's not only about authentication, so telling GitHub, I am Christian Lechner, I have this token. It's also about what am I authorized to do? So what am I allowed to do? For example, am I allowed to update GitHub Action workflows? Well, if I just want to do a read of a repo, probably not. Should I be allowed to, I don't know, we certainly have somewhere a delete the repo, yeah? Well, if I just want to read a repo, basically I will not tick that checkbox. So you can narrow down the access rights that you have with such a token. And again, GitHub is here a quite good example how you can do that and how you see how granular you can do that. So that the level of granularity is quite high. Coming back to your question with respect to the functions API, so usually you would not just deploy your function and expose the function endpoint directly, but you would probably, let me shortly take a bit of water. You would probably put something in front of your function endpoint, which might be an API gateway or some web application firewall, some things that would save you from, let's say, DDoS attacks, so distributed denial of service attacks, when a lot of folks try to hit the endpoint and want to try out when it comes down. Or you would use an API gateway in order to do some throttling, for example. So as we saw here, you can then check, maybe somebody wants to do a lot of requests and you say, hey, sorry, but within a minute you only are allowed to do 45 requests, and that's nothing that is built in within Azure Functions, and that's for a good reason. You have to plug in an additional functionality within Azure, and you have that with API management or an API gateway in order to make that reality. So when you really want to do that on a, let's say, professional, so don't get me wrong, professional level, production grade level, how you would do it in real enterprise software, then you will put something in front of your function in order to secure it with respect to attacks, and also with respect to who is allowed to call it. So you would have such a token, and probably you would also have some additional information then on, I don't know if that was shown in the session about Azure Static Web Apps by Anthony. You can authenticate, for example, you can use Azure Active Directory to authenticate to get some more information about you, and then use the information that is there in order to guide the processing and secure your endpoints. So that's all possible, but that's very different and well, difficult topic. And there are a lot of ways how to do that. It also depends on what you want to achieve. But there are a lot of options, and that's, from my perspective, really a field of its own to be there really an expert and get all the right knobs into place in order to have a secure endpoint.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian. I don't think we have any other questions right now. But for the students, if you do ever have questions about this, like Christian mentioned earlier, feel free to ask them to our mentors via Piazza, or talk to your one-on-one mentors on Discord. And yeah, you can reach out to us on any of our social media platforms. But yeah, thank you so much, Christian, for this workshop. I think it was really valuable for students to really get a deep dive into APIs and get started with using APIs for their own final projects, which are currently in progress. I'm really excited to see what students end up building.
Yeah, cool. Hope you had some fun. Hope you learned
Yeah.
something. Reach out to me if you have some further questions. I will answer them, depending on the time zone. Might be someday.
Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow.
Maybe
Not
in
tomorrow,
an hour where you don't think there should come an answer, but then that's maybe morning in my time zone.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.